Oh, there you go.
Yeah, they're nice and loud now. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to officially begin. This is our third Campaign Nonviolence Skill Building webinar, and this evening we're going to focus on connecting the dots and ways to look at finding those connections between our issues and what to do with them once we find them. I'm Rivera-san. You all know that on this call, but in case you're new and watching this recording, I am the coordinator for Campaign Nonviolence, which is a long-term movement to end war, poverty, racism, and the climate crisis, as well as build the culture of peace and active nonviolence. It's a pretty big, broad mission. There's a lot of different subsets to that endeavor, and we get to work with amazing people like you all over the country. And every week we hold an annual week of actions from September. This year it's September 18th to 26th. And we invite everyone to sign up and do something, one little thing, one big thing, anything that helps advance a culture of nonviolence. So one of the things that we're going to explore tonight about connecting the dots is just understanding that, you know, increasingly our movements in the United States, at least, and I think internationally as well, are recognizing how connected all of the issues are. That an issue of racism often is manifesting in terms of how poverty plays out, or in terms of things like environmental racism with a pipeline being put through an indigenous community. And as we start to see these connections, we start to have opportunities to organize along those connecting lines and start to build participation in our campaign and have our campaign show up for a like-minded or aligned issue or campaign that's going on in our community. So I'm just going to share a few slides, and then I'm going to ask you guys what you're working on, what you're thinking about in your communities. So I'll just tell you that ahead of time to get you started on thinking about it. Not that one. Great. So, you know, as you know, Campaign Nonviolence has been organizing for 7 years now. We've always been working intersectionally. We've let our local organizers define which pieces of the dots, the connected dots, they're going to work on. But, you know, we've had people working on nuclear weapons. We've had them working on building a culture of peace and ending gun violence. They've worked on connecting all these issues in terms of having joint marches and rallies with different groups in their communities. And sometimes this has meant that their turnout has been actually quite large and quite diverse in their community. We also like to encourage people to think about our campaigns, not just about social justice goals, but also about how we're building a culture of nonviolence toward ourselves, towards each other, like in this restorative justice circle. We know that restorative justice is directly intervening in the school to prison pipeline. So it's a really good example of how our issues are really entwined. And when we start to break the link in one place, we start to unravel a whole chain of problems. We also encourage people to think about nonviolence towards all beings and the earth, which is often a dimension that we don't think about, but we need to think about in this time of climate crisis, that if we don't respect the earth, we don't have a lot of time left as a human species on this beautiful planet. And of course, many of us are working on social justice, using nonviolent action, using the tools of nonviolent struggle, and using that approach to actually you know, make major changes in our world. Well, one of the things I wanted to bring up about those 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions is that you can work on all of them at the same time. This is a picture of a community garden in Florida that is specifically working for food justice to dismantle the way that food scarcity and food deserts impact people of color. It's also a place of solace and community connection. So personal nonviolence and interpersonal nonviolence. And of course, you know, they're helping to alleviate hunger in their community as well. So oftentimes we find that when we start working on one piece of the puzzle, we start to automatically have to work on those connecting dots, the inner, the outer, the links between the other movements. So I just want to invite you to come off mute a little bit. And this is a photo from the Standing Rock protests against the DAPL pipeline. And I'm wondering if we can articulate some of the interconnected issues that they're rising up in opposition to or in protection of. Anybody want to share one of them?
The right to protect the environment with the pipeline going under, I think there was the Missouri River.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so protecting the environment, protecting the water. Yeah, what else?
They lost their land, and
Yeah.
it's they just keep going over. They don't. There's a lot of poverty in the area. The indigenous population is still treated as second-class citizens up there. They've lost their rights as a nation, and as individuals, and they can't even protest without being treated like you know, the dredges of society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so dealing with racism, dealing with colonialism, dealing with issues of sovereignty over the land that they do retain, and also, again, colonialism and reclaiming lands. It's also an issue of environmental racism because this pipeline was going to be put through, it was considered being put through a nearby city, mostly white city, and it was shifted south to go through their land.
Yeah.
Anything else we can think of that this is connected to?
This might be kind of the same thing said differently, but the right to continue practicing traditional life ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important one to add in as well. So sometimes we talk about cultural violence as being one of the many kinds of violence that people experience. And that is a perfect example of how cultural violence is enacted in our society, denying people the right to practice their traditional practices, to speak their traditional language, to live in accordance to their traditional customs. Great point. Yeah. So as you can see, when you start working on one thing, many things come up. How about this one? This is a demonstration, I believe it's in New York City. I could be wrong about the city, but by youth who are protesting the, the presence of cops in their public schools. What are the issues that are connected to this one?
The school to prison pipeline, and violence, you know, in the schools.
And just the
Being
terror.
able,
Oh, go ahead, Zio.
being able to safely receive education.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, the fear of when you have police wandering around the schools, then you don't feel safe in your own school if you're a person of color, given the current circumstances, especially.
Yeah, racism, police brutality, violence, the school to prison pipeline. Also, there's a correlation to poverty and the ways that which schools have police officers placed in them, which schools are resourced with other mechanisms of conflict and discipline approaches versus which schools are not. Those often fall right along the lines of poverty and racism and the way that those two things entwine. Yeah, absolutely. So as you can see, it's not hard to sort out the ways that these issues are connected. But one of the things that we can work on as organizers is teasing those out as we're organizing, and using those connections as our tools for engaging our allies in participating in the effort, swaying power holders who may honestly not care very much about one part of our issue, but may care very much about another part. You know, for example, right now I'm working on a campaign to stop the expansion of the military draft to women, right? And instead to abolish it for all genders. And we actually had this very strange, odd bedfellows bipartisan bill before Congress, where, you know, there's a bunch of right-wing politicians who are promoting this because they think the selective service is a complete and utter waste of money. They don't really care about, you know, liberating all young people from military conscription, but they would really like to check off $25 million from the budget and clap themselves on the back. We don't really have any problems with that, right? They will not be our allies on other issues of gender equality, but we can be their allies on this budgetary issue. So yeah, sometimes you can use it as an organizing tool. So now let me turn it back to you. What issues are you and your community working on that are really dear to your hearts? Let's just start with the issues that you're working on, and then let's look at tease out some of those connections. Everything is an appropriate answer, but maybe not quite specific enough for tonight.
Well, I'm going to jump in then. One of the things that I'm trying to do is, because nobody's was working on anything nonviolent in the state of Nebraska when I got here, and I'm on the board of Nebraskans for Peace now, and we've done little dabbling in it and getting little things happening the last couple years, but this year I'm trying to get more widespread, because the areas I'm covering is like Omaha, Lincoln, Grand Island, and then all the rural areas. We have people living that are involved in our organization. And so I'm trying to figure out what to do to draw people in. In the city, we have more of the racial stuff going on in some of the cities. But in like the rural area, we have pipeline stuff going through here, and there's just a variety. So I'm trying to, because so much is going on that can be addressed, I'm trying to get some focus, and I'm trying to get other people interested in looking at nonviolence. And I've been butting heads, not really, but people thinking that, oh, this is more important than using nonviolence. We can't just be nonviolent all the time. And I'm thinking, well, the name of our group is Nebraskans for Peace. That's kind of in our name, you know. So I'm doing all of that, and I finally got the board to say I can start doing some presentation at each board meeting now. So I'm going to use the board meetings as a springboard to get people interested in how can we become more visible in the state, because we still even have missile silos out in western Nebraska that people are concerned about. So we have just a variety of stuff, and I want to get people to focus, you know, as they learn about nonviolence. So help. No, and I'm just looking for suggestions, and I can't get anybody to come to any of these things with me because they're just kind of hesitant, you know. They're fine with the little Zoom squares with people they know, but it's kind of a different ball game, you know. So
interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting reflection. Like sometimes people are more comfortable with their local community than hopping on something national by an organization they don't know very much about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and an interesting challenge you have about, I think many of us kind of chuckled at the struggle around nonviolence, even among our peace organizations, because it is part of the conversation right now nationally, you know, and it's really being driven by by a lot of people who feel like their threat is immediate and present and it should justify their use of violence, which I can't really argue with that. I mean, I would feel similarly. I don't want to judge them for it. But I also think simultaneously we have a challenge in the US where our culture of violence has convinced us that this nonviolent stuff doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
That it's just passive, that there's not enough tools in the toolbox, that it's just being nice to people, that it's just, you know, calling your senators. And we
Yeah.
know that it's actually very provocative, very direct, very disruptive, very effective. And the question really is, how do we infuse that knowledge in our community to such a degree that it starts to shift the conversation around what do we mean by this nonviolent stuff, right?
Yeah. And that's why connecting the dots is critical. If I can help people see how the pipeline and all of that stuff has to do with the racism that's going on in the city, that has to do with the fact that our governor vetoed the SNAP extension for 2 years of more food stamps, you know, the SNAP money. Our governor vetoes it despite the legislature not. So drawing connections between all of these areas and saying this is all interrelated, you know.
You know, and
Yeah.
you could attack it from the idea, or approach it from the idea of poverty as that connecting piece through there. You know, you've got the silos out west that are taking money from people that need housing, food stamps, and so on. You've got the racism where people have been kept in poverty by policy issues, you know, actual decisions to keep a certain group of people in poverty. You've got, you know, the pipelines, the ecological devastation. You know, if you would look at the Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for Moral Revival, I mean, they lay it out that all of these things are interconnected.
Exactly.
You know,
That's exactly. And I'm thinking of, there's a new group starting in Nebraska connected with Reverend Barber. And of course, I've
yes,
been working with them for the last 3 years or something. So that could be like a touchstone, and we can work together on, because I think that they're all new at this whole, just even organizing stuff. You know, people in Nebraska aren't into the organizing. They all run to the state capitol and wave their fists and scream, and then they all go home, you know.
Right.
But there's no like strategy or goals or anything like that. So that's a great idea.
You know, the idea that they use is fusion politics, that there are all these issues are interconnected, and nobody leaves the movement until all of those issues are met, because they're all interconnected, you know. And you get strange bedfellows helping you, like you're saying, you know, because of that interconnectedness.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Yeah.
I mean, they've got, it's so well thought out as a movement. You know, it's not a moment in history. It's continuing to grow and that kind of thing. It's powerful.
Yeah, great.
That's good.
Zia,
Yeah.
what are you thinking about over there?
I'm not working on any one particular thing. And this has kind of been like a struggle for me until I realized that the connector is like an actual role. And so that's kind of why I'm here, is because that's what I hope to be doing. I'm on the board of the Oregon Fellowship of Reconciliation, so that's kind of like a coalition just by nature of different organizations and campaigns and movements. So mostly just hoping to be more effective in that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love that. I'm always trying to skill up my skills too, and because there's so much to learn, right? You know, you can have a lot of skills in one section of it and not so much in the other. For example, I'm really great at strategy for campaigns, and honestly, not that great at organizing like on the ground. So I'm always trying to learn new skills to balance out what I already have in my toolbox. But I think it's an interesting role with a group like FOR, which does have a very, like Campaign Nonviolence, has a very broad policy approach, has a lot of issues on its plate, and is often in a situation of calling people into action, right? So there's a lot of things that they could ask people to do. And I think as an individual activist, one of the things I love most is when the organizations get together and they're like, we're gonna do one campaign together for justice instead of environmental racism, let's say. So two groups come together and I can go to one set of actions for both of them, right? Because otherwise, you know, I'm showing up at 100 activities a month and there just aren't that many days in the month, right? So one of the things you get to do in your role is possibly reach out and convene and say, how can we work together on this? How can we collaborate? And our movements have been notoriously bad at collaborating. They've been really territorial, right? And a little bit of that comes out of capitalism, the nonprofit model structure, a little bit of competition between personalities. But I think, you know, the more we can help massage our organizations and the individuals to see each other in the spirit of collaboration, the stronger our movements will become.
Yeah, I think one of the big questions that has been on my mind lately is how we do that when at first two goals can really seem kind of in opposition to each other. For instance, as gains are being made in where, like, in certain instances less people are being imprisoned, and then that's like freeing up space in the prisons for detention centers and for ICE to then jump in. And so it's like, well, we can't say it, like do one and not the other, but we also can't like tiptoe around either issue, because both really badly need strong action now. So just like crafting language and showing up for each other in ways that are both effective and recognizing how deeply complicated a lot of this is.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the prison abolition movement, right, has really bold goals around shutting down mass incarceration and the ways that it impacts people of color who are US citizens, and poor people in general. And they're also working in solidarity with campaigns that are working to shut down detention centers, right? Because they already know that if they reduce mass incarceration, that the capitalist model that wants to fill those beds and keep churning out the money is just going to shift into detention or even private detention. Sometimes we see that. But there's groups in LA, like, you know about, shoot, what are they called? I'm gonna mess up their name, but I think they're like Abolition Justice or Justice LA, but they are campaigning to stop prisons from being built and to shut down existing prisons, kind of for both reasons. Yeah. Good questions, Zio. I'm not sure I have all the answers to them, but I am deeply curious about all of them. Mary, how about you? What are you thinking about working on?
Working on educating educators about nonviolence education in schools with Robin Wildman. And also we're working on a book discussion panel thing with Lieutenant, I can't think of his name, but anyway, he wrote a book talking about why do we teach our kids to kill? And it's all about the violent video games and all of that, you know, there's studies that show what it does to the brain, and you see, you know, these mass shootings that kids and young people are acting out of that model. So those are two things we're working on. And then on the side, working on bringing up this lynching memorial from Montgomery about the lynchings that took place in the county that I live in and stuff. So lots of different areas to work on for sure. But
Well, those are three really great projects, very specific and very tangible, very immediate, all really great goals and things that like noticeably move your community in a more nonviolent and just direction. So I really appreciate that. Yeah, one of the things we're going to do in a little bit is we're going to look at how to use these interconnected issues or connecting the dots to find those odd bedfellows and the unexpected allies. But before we do that, I'd love to invite us to do kind of a group mapping exercise together for Campaign Nonviolence. And this is a tool that you can use with your Campaign Nonviolence group or ZO with FOR participants in just getting us to see where are our most connected issues, right? Where are the issues that have the most connection points in our community? So just let me put in the chat box a link. So I'm going to invite you to click on this link, and it's going to take you to a Google Jamboard. Let me know if you have any trouble opening it. It should be all right, but oh, look, Anonymous Blobfish joined. There you are. Great. So I'm going to pull this up on my screen share just so the recording can see it. And I'll tell you what this is about in just a second. You might have to come out of screen share in order to get to your browser tab where this is. So this is a map of campaign nonviolence in the negative sense. These are all the things that we're trying to solve or resolve, right? There's also a converse map that we won't necessarily use tonight that are all the solutions. But I think what we'll find is the solutions are as deeply interconnected as the problems. Are almost like a mirror image of each other. So, you know, we have one central thing of uprooting and dismantling violence, and then 4 major sectors: environmental destruction, poverty, racism, and war. And what I'd love to invite you to do is to just click on over on the left-hand side. You're going to see a sticky note on your toolbar, and it'll pull up this little sticky note function. And you can write one of the issues that is connected to one of these 4 issues. So war and nuclear weapons go together, so nukes. And when I save it, it's going to pop it down on the board. And then when I get out of this, I can just move this nukes over here next to war. So I'm going to invite you to just populate the board with a lot of different issues and kind of put them over where you think they cluster around. Does that make sense?
we have to do it on where the link is, right?
Yes, you can't do it on the screen. You
Yeah.
need to come out of full screen mode and just go to that link in the chat box.
Gotcha.
Yep. Just toss on as many as you can think of. There are plenty of issues. Hi, Rich. I just want to welcome you. We're in a bit of screen share right now, but I will put in the chat box again the link to what we're working on. We're just doing this group jam board. There we go. You should be able to find that in the chat box now. And if you click on that link, it'll take you to this Jamboard where we're hopping on issues that we care about and kind of mapping them on this board of the campaign nonviolence issues. So we have violence in the center of the board. We have environmental destruction up in the top right, top left, poverty over on the top right, racism on the bottom right, and war on the bottom left. And what we're seeing, and we can start to move these around a little bit, is if you have an issue on the board that also connects to another issue, kind of drag it over in between those two, right? Yeah, so the military industrial complex. For example, I put recruitment in schools on the board, and that's an issue around war, militarism, but it's also an issue around poverty, and it also actually is an issue around racism and the way that those two tie together. Yeah, and I see someone had the war machine and the Pentagon, and that's a good issue that kind of ties together environmental destruction and war.
Thank you, Rivera. I'm sorry for being a little bit tardy. I had a dinner with family that ran a little bit longer than I thought it was going to.
That's totally fine. We're glad you're here with us now. Yeah, so look around. If you see any that you think should shift a little bit, move a little bit, go ahead and move them. See if you can find their home on this map. Where do they most relate to? Yeah, sometimes you got to move it one place and think about it and maybe shift it over again. Yeah, so looking around the board, what are some issues that have a lot of connections, connect a lot of the dots together? What do you notice? Just come off mute and share.
Certainly racism and poverty.
Yeah, a lot of different ways that shows up, right?
Mhm.
I like this one about police brutality, that it's kind of hanging over towards between racism and war. And I actually want to shift it up just a little bit to be connected also to poverty and the way that that expresses. So it really stands at this nasty little triumvirate. But when we think about things like pipeline struggles, we're also seeing police brutality showing up there as well. What else do you notice?
I actually almost want to move the military industrial complex up a little bit closer to environmental destruction because of
Yes.
how much damage the environment, like our history of weapons testing, and how much fuel we burn through transporting tanks, guns, and bombs around the planet. It's pretty hefty. There's a figure that was in one of my courses recently that was talking about just how much of an environmental impact U.S. militarization has.
Yeah, absolutely. So I shifted it up there, but I couldn't put it too far because I feel like it also connects to racism
Yeah.
quite a bit. I mean, we can't really talk about the US military without also acknowledging that it expresses itself in entirely racist ways in terms of global war and conflict and a number of other things. What else? What else do you notice? Kathy, Zio?
I'm almost wondering if worsening storms and flooding of coastlines gets moved a little further toward the center, or maybe even to the center. It just seems so connected to everything that's on the board.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we'll just put it right here. Because I was like, yes, there's a complete connection to racism. I mean, we have Pacific Islanders losing their entire islands. We have like the Gullah people losing their islands along South Carolina and Georgia. But then when we think about the refugee crisis, right, the quote unquote refugee crisis that we're causing, you know, it's directly connected to war and conflicts that are breaking out often because of climate issues. I don't know about specifically about the coastlines actually, but other climate issues that would hold true for. Yeah, what else are we seeing?
There's also, I also wanted to suggest this too when thinking about the military industrial complexes. One of the things that I looked at recently was how like some of these major weapons manufactured in the United States, like Lockheed Martin or Boeing, how they package up their image to the public. And one of the things that they've been increasingly doing is trying to present themselves in this very inclusive way. Like, say, we do a lot to promote anti-racist practices, or we're very inclusive and pro-LGBT. And it's kind of created this really interesting, almost tragic effect of like, to buy into, we become more, they're trying to create this like more support of the military industrial complex because of, say, the things that they're claiming to do in challenging racism or challenging poverty. And it's by bringing in, say, minority scientists or some along those lines. So it's almost like they're connected, but it's the connections are kind of strange nowadays, where I think many of us looking at those ones are sort of confused as to how do we, they're like taking away something that something we could charge them with by saying, oh, but we're not racist, or we're challenging poverty, or even now, like environmental destruction is being packaged up by the military. It's like, oh, we need to protect the environment because it provides us with tactical and strategic advantage over our foes. So it's like stealing something from the world, I think, or stealing part of this narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. They're co-opting the narratives of justice movements in order to inure themselves against the critiques of justice movements. Some people call that with the military specifically the politics of inclusion versus liberation. It's a part of the thing that we've been talking about with the draft, and LGBTQ communities have really been trying to articulate this as, you know, Don't Ask, Don't Tell got overturned, but just really trying to lift the critique level. And, you know, Zio, this goes back to something you were saying about the detention centers and the mass incarceration prisons. Is like we're often being told as movement organizers that we can't have both things, right? It's got to be one or the other. When we're like, no, it could be both things, right? And so the same goes true for what you were saying, Rich. You know, if we're going to have a military, sure, let's have it be inclusive and representative and all of that. But then let's question, like, why do we really need a military, and why is it the only job on the block, right? And we want everybody to be able to be a part of that critique and conversation, right? And we don't really want to wait, you know, another 3 decades in order to sort that out. So I agree, it is a tangled web we weave, as they say. So if you look around this board, I'm just going to pull out a marker tool for a minute. If you're looking for issues that are going to have a lot of people involved in them, The ones that are the ones that are towards the center are going to connect a lot of dots between those issues. The other thing you want to look at is just the sheer size of the impact. For example, half of our country is living in poverty. So those are issues that hit 40 to 50% of the populace right off the bat. So when we're looking for issues that we want to campaign around, when we start to think about these issues that are more in the center, in terms of how they connect to all the other issues, if we can articulate how homelessness is directly connected to racism and poverty, then we can, and war because of military veterans being one of the big groups who end up on the street, then we have 3 different groups of allies that we can call upon. And, you know, honestly, a lot of our campaigns against homelessness or for the rights of unhoused people aren't calling on those 3 groups, right? They're not calling on racial justice organizers or the Veterans Society that well. So the same could be said for any of these issues and many of the issues that we're working on. So this mapping tool is something that you can use with your groups to start to see how everything's connected. And you can dial this down even more specifically for your community. You can start to say, what are the issues in our community as they relate to these? You can shake up what the 4 corners are depending on what is needed in your circumstance. And one of the things you start to see is these unexpected connections, right? Because we've been thinking about an issue like immigration as a very specific kind of issue, right? Maybe we're thinking about it as a racism issue, right? Because we think of immigrants as South or Latin American. But then someone says, no, the thing about immigration is that they don't have fair opportunities for employment. It's a poverty issue. And someone says, well, what about the wars, right? A lot of our immigrants are refugees and asylum seekers from our wars, either proxy wars or flat out wars. And others say, well, what about the climate refugees that are coming? And all of a sudden you start to see, oh, immigration is actually an issue that stands in the middle of all of these things. And maybe we have really good connections to racial justice organizing. We might have a few good connections to war, but we hadn't really thought about how this issue connects to the climate crisis, right? And that there are a lot of people in our community who are really passionate about stopping the climate crisis. So these are all ways to start to think differently about the issues. Any thoughts or comments from you all?
This is a good visual to show those connections, you know, physically, that really makes sense.
I like how this can be an ongoing, like we can do this as a group in one session and then keep it around for the duration of the campaign as we learn more and connect more. It's like a living document kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you could add different different groups, different, you could, you know, you could clear off a lot of the board and you could say, okay, the thing we're going to work on is immigration, right? So we're actually going to move immigration to the center of this board. And now we're going to map all the different groups that are working on poverty. And we're going to see how many of them we can bring into our efforts around this. So you can use this tool in a wide variety of ways.
Is this a Google type of thing, or?
This is called a Google Jamboard.
Okay.
And the way you find it is if you have a Gmail account, if you look where your Google Docs are and just scroll down the list a little, you'll find the Jamboard. It's got this funny little J symbol.
It's cool.
I like them. I find them really useful for things like this. All right, I'm going to stop the share. Great. So I hope this is helpful. I hope this is like starting to stir your juices about how you can tease apart these connections that are just, they're kind of lurking on the periphery of our how we think about our issues, right? We often try to find the one big important thing and then go pound that issue. But actually, we know from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen that one of the things that makes nonviolent struggles succeed is participation. In fact, that is the most important thing. And not just people caring about the issue, but people actually taking action in ways that remove their cooperation from the injustice, or they intervene in the operation of the injustice. So one of the things that looking for the ways that it connects the dots does is it's finding opportunities to find your allies, right? To search out and discover who are those people who are, if we're thinking about a spectrum of allies, which I think most of you on this call have seen and done with me on Zoom. If we're thinking about the people who are our passive allies, who they might care about the issue, but they're not doing very much, oftentimes they need a direct invitation that relates to the thing that they are most passionate about, right? So maybe they're not active on police brutality, but they are actually, you know, climate justice advocates like you can't even believe. And the thing you need to do is go to them and say, if you don't stand up with our Black Lives Matter group right now, when you try to stop that pipeline from coming through, what do you think is going to happen? How do you think our police are going to behave? And your privilege, if it's a group of privilege, isn't necessarily going to hold up, right? This is the time to stand up now, and they can stand up as who they are, right? They don't have to, actually, I'm going to share my screen for this next point again. One of the things about building alliances is that sometimes we want them to be in lockstep with us. But what we really need is them to show up authentically as who they are and what they care about. And a really good example of this happened when the No Kids in Cages campaign really took off. And this is the unexpected group of allies that really rose up and really kind of reframed the issue for people. These are survivors of Japanese internment camps during World War II, an issue that is, as it's becoming more well known, people are very angry about this. They view it as immoral, as wrong, largely because, you know, we built a whole war campaign on liberating Jews from concentration camps, and oh gosh, we did it too. So the Japanese stood up really clearly over and over again in Texas, in I think Ohio was another location where they organized big actions to say we need to stop repeating history. Families belong together. It was wrong when you did it to us, and it's wrong right now. And they took an issue that was being looked at as a migrant justice issue and said, no, this is a moral issue for the soul of our country. That if we don't want to be the Nazis, we need to deal with this issue very differently. So a very powerful example of finding those lines of connections in actually an almost unexpected place. So the other way to look at this, and this is a great example of it, is the unexpected allies, the odd bedfellows, right? So the Cowboy and Indian Alliance, that was their phrase for their alliance. In Nebraska, Kathy, I think, organized to stop the KXL pipeline. They did a number of actions together, including direct actions in Nebraska, including a big rally in DC that got a lot of media attention. And it was that idea of, here are two groups of people who oftentimes are diametrically opposed, but they have found common ground around not wanting this pipeline to go through. And behind the scenes, there was a lot of organizing work to get that coalition going, to bridge that divide that had historically existed between the two groups. But one of the things that happened when that Cowboy and Indian Alliance rose up was it really pulled people out of the woodwork for a number of different reasons. The ranchers suddenly felt like they had a place in the movement. People who cared more about water than, say, the climate crisis felt like they had a place in the movement. So that's one of the things that these odd bedfellows do is sometimes they bring really positive spins on the issue you're facing. And sometimes, like I was saying before with the draft campaign, they're working for the same goal for a reason you may not agree with at all. And you need to make a strategic call about what kind of a relationship you're going to have with them. For example, with the draft group that I'm a part of, you know, one of the groups campaigning to stop the expansion of the military draft to women are literally the right-wing people who are like the women's places in the home, right? And I'm like, I can't really like stand up and say, wow, thank you so much for working on this with me, but I'm not going to get in your way. Right? If you want to go call the Republicans into action in this and they want to all ditch the draft expansion, that's great. I have no problems with that. The thing to be aware of is that they're not going to be my allies on a bill to abolish the selective service, right? So you need to think through some of these ally groups carefully and really think about where can you stand in solidarity, where can you stand at a distance, where can you ignore each other entirely, but let them do their thing because it's going to help advance towards the goal. So let me turn the questions back to you now. When you think about the issues that you're working on, and we shared a little bit about that earlier, let's start with the odd bedfellows, right? Think about those issues. Who might be a few odd bedfellows on those campaigns? Maybe we can pick on Mary a little bit because Mary's working on this campaign with the book club about keeping kids. Why do we teach our kids to kill? Right? So who are the obvious allies? Parents, right? Teachers, peace activists. But who are the unexpected or odd allies on that?
I don't know if you might find some connection with the police.
Yeah. They may very well be a really unexpected group. And you wouldn't necessarily know till you went and talked to them, right?
Right, right.
Psychologists and therapists
Oh, yeah, yeah.
might be really not necessarily odd bedfellows. They might be just unexpected ones.
Mm-hmm.
Involving the youth themselves as empowered agents of protecting themselves.
Yeah, great point, Zio. I just read about this campaign, which is so cool. In California, the teens are organizing to stop relationship violence. So whether it's parent to kids in the house, whether it's girlfriend, boyfriend, whether it's sibling to sibling, whether it's friend to friend, whatever it is, they're directly organizing with each other to try to stop all of that from happening or give kids options for what to do if it is happening. I thought it was so cool that the youth were organizing it.
Might be a bit of a stretch, but one of the things I think of is maybe members of the pro-life movement.
Mm.
As far as odd bedfellows go. If you really craft a narrative to be sort of like, I mean, there's that old humorous statement, right, where Republicans or the pro-life movement believe that life begins at conception and ends at birth. Let's maybe package that up to be sort of a challenge to that. Be like, okay, so if you really believe that children have a right to life from the very beginning, then maybe that should be something that a message that we craft to continue throughout their entire lives, and it needs to start young.
That's true, because that's what happened at the border. The pro-life groups went down to the border to protect the kids in cages and all of that, because they were trying to change that, the more, I don't know, middle of the road pro-life people, and that was very effective. And I was going to say churches as well would be a good, with the anti-bullying, or just different denominations would, might be approachable and allies in that as well, Mary.
Veterans might be a strange group that you wouldn't expect, but those who have come back from war, many of whom can't even watch those video games because it triggers PTSD. Many of whom are like really pissed off at the whole funnel of those and rarely get an outlet for talking about it. Yeah. Yeah. This is a really off the wall one, but Odd Bedfellows are all about the off the wall ideas. But if your town has a game store, like a board game store, like maybe they are the people who want to fund your banners on the campaign or your flyers, right? Because they actually end up making more money if you do that, right? Great. Let's get some another issue. Kathy, do you want to bring up one of the things you're working on? We're happy to find odd bedfellows for you.
I'm just having a hard time narrowing because my mind is like swirling around from border to border and all around trying to figure out what might be. I think, as we were talking earlier, one of the big issues though is the state is trying to fund a new prison, and build a new prison in, even though a lot of groups have been trying to get people not incarcerated. Let's don't wait until they end up in filling the prison and then our prisons are overflowing and we need a new prison. So there's actually a lot of groups that want to work on it but don't have, they just go to the state capitol and yell and wave their fists and then go home. And so that might be a good issue to get a lot of different groups around. I don't know.
Yeah, sounds like there's already some energy and momentum there. It would be interesting to invite people from the campaigns in LA, and there's some amazing campaigns happening in, I think, Atlanta, Georgia. I think they've stopped like three prisons from being built. And one of the ways that they've done that, besides working on the city, which has to permit them, or the county, I think, is by pressuring the banks. And they actually got the banks to pull out of funding them. So, in your case, maybe one of the things to do is to invite these unexpected allies from other places to do Zoom presentations on what they're doing, what's working for them. And both of those particular campaigns are extremely diverse, extremely well organized, organized by people of color. And I think that would be probably be a hit event in your area, honestly.
Oh no, I think that would be wonderful. Yeah, that's a great idea. See, we also have a peace conference coming up. It actually has always hit during the Nonviolence Week, except this time they're not doing it till October now. But that doesn't mean we can't, we can continue on. But yeah, that's a good idea. Getting these out. And that's the thing, is that Zoom has created opportunities where we're not limited with the amount of money in our pocket and having to pay for hotel and air flight and bring a bunch of people in. That's an excellent idea, Revere. Thank you.
Any other thoughts on this about those odd bedfellows, unexpected allies, favorite campaigns where you saw that happen in an unexpected way?
I think you could maybe bring in mothers and children who have been affected by their father or whatever, a child, being incarcerated, and how it affects the family, the whole family. I don't know if any of the ranchers or farmers are, want to give up that amount of land for something like that. And you could look at how much water is it going to take to keep this prison going.
That's actually one thing we're not lacking in. We're right over the largest aquifer in the world, the Ogallala Aquifer. So we do have a lot of water around most of the time underground, but yeah.
Yeah, right.
But the
But
land, finding out where they're going to put it and all of that stuff.
when they do
you
find out where they would
Right.
put it, would it pollute that water?
Right.
Yeah. And that's the whole deal about the pipeline is,
Right.
that's why we tried to
Bringing
stop
that
that.
up.
Yeah.
Is it taken away from Native American land?
It might be interesting to see where the money to build it was coming from and if it was being taken out of other funds.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's a great
That's an
point.
excellent idea.
And I think the money thing is I think there's also an opportunity there, taking from CEO's point, is you could bring up the point of, okay, so instead of a prison, couldn't we be using it for business development and engage a little bit more of the capitalist structure to be like, well, you have a prison, but you can make way more money doing this thing, but like making a strip mall. But of course, then it gets into the other, like, and I guess this is kind of highlighting some of the challenges in trying to create this craft and narrative that's precise enough to target what you're trying to accomplish, but general enough to bring inclusivity. Like, that's walking the knife edge. In that, if we're talking about bringing in more capitalist interests as being supporters of perhaps stopping prison, that puts maybe their goals a little bit at odds with, say, a group that's more involved with trying to protect the sanctity of the water in the area, right? Because you start bringing commercial development, that's going to have problems. So how we maintain that alliance, but then also, even if you're successful, what's the next steps? That's the question I don't really have an answer for.
Yeah, and one of the things is that they say our prison is outdated and full. And I was thinking of, let's not fill up the prison. What kind of diversion programs prior to that point where we have to house, people in prisons because, they were bad, so what types of diversion, what types of education, what types of job training, what types of restorative justice work can be done as opposed to just housing people in a prison. So, that there are a potential for a lot of allies, and getting people to think of, not the end point, but, addressing the problems before they are problems.
Yeah, Rich, you just brought up another really important thing to consider. We've talked about it a little bit, but one of the reasons you want to do some of this mapping work about where the connections are is because you do want to identify where you have an ally that is actually a liability, right? Where what they will be satisfied with is not going to satisfy other requirements of justice, let's say. And some of them are surprising. And I don't know if this is your situation in Nebraska, Kathy, but sometimes when we're looking at the criminal justice system and poverty, even police brutality sometimes has this come up. in some areas, the people who are most impacted by that, just by their demographics, are poor white people, right? And so when our campaign is organizing purely on a racial justice front, that can alienate a lot of people in that particular community because they're feeling the injustice, but they're not feeling included in the movement. So sometimes thinking through how do we frame these connections, how do we do that outreach work, how do we do the education work so that if we do have that kind of a situation, we have opportunities for saying, yeah, this is the numbers here, this is the numbers nationally, and this is our opportunities to stand in solidarity with one another. Yeah, I could tell you a whole lot of stories about that, but I won't.
I guess, like, hopefully best case scenario, if you can figure out how to work this, is by coming together for this one campaign when it is time to move on to the next thing. The two groups have built some trust and understanding of each other, and maybe, hopefully, it'd be more possible to work toward a future that would be beneficial to both.
Well, stranger things have happened, actually. And, you know, if we look at nonviolent campaigns throughout, like, especially US history, because we have so many fraught issues, we actually do see a number of times when those happen. We also see some horrible fails, women's suffrage and Black emancipation, is a really classic fail. But you know, one of the stories that comes to mind is in the feature film Best of Enemies, where they're trying to desegregate the Durham, North Carolina schools. And this is in like 1970, it's actually quite late. And a court orders them to hold a charrette process, right? So a community conversation for 11 days. And at the end of the 11 days, the board of the charrette, which is like 7 or 8 people, is going to vote desegregate or keep segregation. And the two organizers, one is this Black woman labor organizer, Ann Atwater. The other one is C.P. Ellis. He's the leader of the Klan, right? So the two are in competition to get as many people in the room so that they can outvote the other, basically. They end up getting like 1,000 people in their community participating over the 11 days. But in the process, they start to get to know each other quite a bit. And, you know, Anne finds out that C.P. Ellis's son is mentally different, let's say, and CP's feeling really betrayed by the system. He can't afford to keep his son in the hospital where he needs. Anyway, long story short, they get to the day of the vote and they're voting, right? And it all comes down to C.P. Ellis, the leader of the Klan. And Ann Atwater is just like, oh my God, we just lost. And C.P. Ellis stands up and says, I'm renouncing my role in the Klan. And he tears up his Klan card and he votes to desegregate the schools because of the connection they've been building, because he understood that Ann Atwater cared about his son and cared about economic justice. And it turned out that the Klan ended up organizing the white people to boycott his gas station. So Ann Atwater actually organized the Black people to come and boycott his gas station. So anyway, it's a great little story of how, you know, if you do the organizing work with a lot of intention and integrity, you do open up that spot for some really kind of mind-blowing change to happen. All right, so I wanted to give you a few more tools before we end. And these have to do with how to use nonviolent action, particularly acts of protest and persuasion, in ways that help us kind of lift up the interconnections of the issues. So I'm just gonna show my screen one more time. So we can illuminate the connections of the issues using all of our tools. In this, we see banners and we see signs, we see slogans, but we know from this, well, let me ask you, like, what is this action about? what can we deduce from just even this one image?
Well, it's about stopping line 3 of the pipeline. It protects the water. Treaties have been violated, and they wouldn't have to try to protect the water if the federal government honored the treaties that were signed generations ago.
Right. Yeah, so we can infer that because treaties are involved, we're talking about indigenous groups as
Mm.
well. Maybe that would be lost on a few people.
Yeah,
But
I think, sorry.
we can, but we can hope, right? We can tell that, you know, they care about the animals. We see the heron and the duck. We have this image of the hands evoking care, cradling, protection. So there's actually quite a bit being conveyed, even with just this one banner, that we know, like, that it's pipeline, environment, water, and indigenous people at the very least. And those are 4 big pieces of their issue. And they didn't actually use any of those words I just used except for water. So this is an action that happened in Chico, California. And they use this shared imagery of the sunflower or the dandelion. It could be the dandelion, given the group. They read a piece of my book. But they use this shared imagery to unite a bunch of different angles on why the city should pass the climate action plan, right? And you can see that they've got electrify everything. So the electric people are in it. Peace and climate justice is in there. Keep Chico green. Share the sun. I can't read all of them, but the basic idea that they're using here is to use one unifying kind of style to uplift a lot of different ways that they're connecting. So the visual image connects it in our mind. This is another really great example of how they're connecting issues. So their connecting thread is justice, justicia. And, you know, they're using the different qualifiers: worker, migrant, climate, labor, and they're uniting them through a shared imagery. This is for a May Day action. So when many of you may remember this is the big climate march in New York City. They actually had different blocks of different groups. So the unions marched as a group, the peace activists marched as a group, the indigenous people led the parade, a bunch of youth groups came out as their group, racial justice groups came out as their block. So you can use that kind of an organizing to create blocks. And when you hold an action like that, you put the onus on the organization saying, we're gonna hold a space for you. Get your 10 to 10,000 people there, right? Oftentimes when we want to build participation, we think we just need to like put out an open call, but sometimes what you need to do is put out a specific invitation. And so sometimes when you do the legwork on connecting the dots, you're able to go to the groups and say, we want you to be a part of this march. And we want you to hold your signs for demilitarization. You know, war is not green, right? We understand the connection and we want you to be there. They also used a really unifying slogan to change everything. We need everyone. And so right off the bat, people knew that there was a kind of a unifying theme. There was a unity and diversity kind of a theme. And it was just a really great way to, especially when that march happened, to connect the dots that hadn't been getting connected. So I could go on a lot about that. There's a million ways to do it. I've seen rallies where they have different sectors and they do shout outs from the stage, and every sector like gives a cheer when their name comes up. You could do shared banners. One of the things I was going to get an image of and I didn't is some of the street mural teams in San Francisco. what they've been doing is one big slogan and then circular, smaller images that they invite groups to fill in that part of the mural. So every organization has their space on the street mural, which I think is brilliant. Really, really smart way to connect those dots. So do you have any thoughts or ideas about how you can use some of these tactics to connect those dots?
Well, actually, in terms of visual imagery, one of the things that stands out to me, I'm thinking of that one image that you shared there of the Statue of Liberty and climate action. And it's almost like a very general way to bring people together is to sort of put in some patriotic imagery. It's a very common thing, especially here in the United States, where I almost feel as though everybody here needs to, like everybody, whether you're right wing, left wing, center, what have you, believe in this or that, we're all in some sense bought into a little bit of this national pride. And that almost forms like a very quick and easy way of visually connecting various groups, where at the end of the day, what are we all pushing for? Well, we want our country to be better. We differ on what that really means in practice, but I think a lot of it comes down to the very general narrative of we want our country to be better, to do better. I think that has a powerful visual symbolism that can be used in, I think, almost any kind of action, unless maybe we're talking about particular movements that are more on the cessationist side. But that's a discussion. That's an interesting group. They're out there.
That's a good point.
I don't really know how to. That's an interesting group to connect to. But they're almost like it's hard to find a commonality on some. Well, depending upon what the foundations of the cessationist movement is, you can probably find something. But though they're at the ends are going to be going towards are a bit far in some sense. But yeah, I think that that use of patriotic symbolism, regardless of how you feel about nationalism, I think it can prove a very useful tool in certain circumstances.
Zia, did you want to add something? No, you're good. So just to your point, Rich, our little action group here locally actually crashed our local 4th of July parade with a march for whistleblowers, activists, and muckrakers. And, you know, I thought we were going to get arrested and thrown out of the parade because we didn't sign up. We just marched in there, popped in, and walked down the road. And, you know, we had signs for Snowden. We had signs for Daniel Ellsberg, like notorious activists in history and present. We had giant puppets. But we had this one banner that said, "There's more than one way to be a patriot." And at the end of the march, we were all the way at the other end of the road, and the little official comes running down the road to us. And I was like, oh, shoot, here it comes. They're going to arrest us or something. And he said, you need to come to the judge's booth right now. And I was like, oh, okay, everybody else, stay here. I'll go. They can go get me in trouble. And I go over there, and then I said, what's this about? And they said, well, you've just won first prize for most patriotic. And they gave us $300. I was like, we don't even have an organization to receive money. But this is a great example of what you're saying, Rich, of, you know, sometimes when you wrap yourself in the flag, strange and interesting things happen. But what this really comes down to is commonly held values. And if you can explain your issue in some of those really basic values that we hold in common, you're really going to be able to not just convince your opponents to understand what you're talking about, you're also going to mobilize more active support. So these are things like safety and security are two really big ones for the US. Respect, super important, right? So putting that incinerator in our neighborhood is disrespectful to the people here. Is very persuasive to the American psyche. Things like love, actually. We love our children as much as you do, right? Family, it's very important. What are some other ones that you can think of?
Well, it does remind me of the sign that gets you to slow down, right? Drive like your children live here. I think that kind of a message, sort of generalized to a movement or an action, I think has a very sort of trying to break down the lines between us and them, trying to find things like, you know, country and family, which, you know, those are very like, well, I live next to a politician who her lines are God, country, family, and you can imagine what that means in terms of her particular beliefs. But God, country, family, but you know, what does that really break down to? It means that you have a certain ethics that comes from Christianity. You're a patriot in your own way, and you believe in a nuclear family of some kind. And we have varying definitions, I think, of what patriotism looks like. We have varying definitions of what a family is, but at the end of the day, it's really about the people we love. And maybe some of us have varying degrees of religiousness or spirituality or what have you, but there is something there that can be crafted to bind us together in weird ways. So it's almost like, how do we generalize the point of, you know, drive like your children live here across that idea of, you know, somebody believes in God, country, family. Well, God, country, family, more power to you. Just got to figure out the common baseline for all of that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Those commonly held values, if you can figure out how to explain what you care about in terms of what they care about, and that's really key, right? So a lot of times our movements, we're trying to express ourselves. We want to be heard, we want to be understood, we want the suffering of our people and our community to be really acknowledged. And that's really vitally important. And it's not the same thing as talking to the people who need to make a shift in language that they understand and value, right? And so strategically, you want to make space for the movement to express itself. You also want to craft messaging that's going to help the people you need to make a shift understand why they want to make that shift, right? Or why it's not threatening to them, or why it makes nothing but sense, or why it aligns with family values, like Kathy's story about the Christian pro-life crowd going to the border for family values, right? Those moments are really important. So we are at the end of our time together. Next time, we are going to hear from Deborah Mathis, who is this amazing media person. Please tell all your friends, this is a gem of a session. She has worked with the James Lawson Institute. She'll tell you way more about those commonly held value type of things than I can even express. She's very skillful. Please don't miss it. So let's just close out tonight we're a small group, so just going around saying one or two things that was really helpful for you tonight.
I appreciated the understanding of the Jamboard and how to use that to look for those issues that are held in common, you know, related and stuff. That was very good.
I appreciated how much time was spent on like generative kind of brainstorming. Just the practice of that I find refreshing and helpful.
I always like hearing what others are doing and planning, because that gets me thinking, because what people are doing up in different areas, it all relates. But I also really appreciated Richard's comments on, because he's looking at things from a way that I haven't looked at them. And you've given me a lot of insight when you were talking about the patriotism and all that, because I have a tendency to shy away from that kind of stuff. And you just got me thinking, and of course with Rivera's example too about the parade, I thought, yeah, because I'm in a red state, you know, and deep red, and thank you.
I too am kind of in a red state, Pennsylvania, purple, rural Pennsylvania, so that's red.
Yeah.
But yeah, I appreciated honestly I'll second the Jamboard because I think that helps visualize something that's very complex in movements, trying to figure out, you know, where we can make connections. But one of the things I did really appreciate too was Rivera's story about C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater. I was looking that up in the background because that story is extremely powerful and meaningful to me because it's given me inspiration. So in my own work and trying to study, you know, violence in demonstrations and looking at a case like Portland, where things have gotten so challenging, where everybody's at each other's throats at the moment, and it's not just, you know, the obvious like racial justice demonstrators and policemen, but it's other groups there that believe in racial justice but are undertaking diversity of tactics as a euphemism for let's burn down buildings and break windows. And it's like, it's hard to fault them for that, but it's also putting a lot of people at risk and trying to figure out, even within our own movements, how we can rebuild relations to the point where things can become unified again, but in the right way, winning this battle in the right way. Because you can't win this battle the wrong way. If you've won it the wrong way, you've actually lost, right? So I think winning it the right way necessitates trying to bring these more extreme elements back to a sense of reason about how can we win this the right way, as opposed to winning the wrong way, which is let's wage war against the U.S. government. Good luck with that. It's not going to go that far. So I think that story kind of gives me this ethos of inspiration for how to think about that case.
Well, thank you all. I feel refreshed and renewed and really glad to have spent this very special time with all of you. I mean, I'm so glad that we were a small group tonight, so I could really hear what you're thinking about. We could really share from our perspectives. I felt like I really, in some strange and mysterious way, got to like really sit down with people all across this beautiful, crazy country that we share. And really talk about what is change making? How do we really work for change in these complex settings in ways that are meaningful and respectful, even to those who completely disagree with us, right? So thank you all. This has been a real treat and a pleasure, and I hope I see you next month as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about being late.
No problem.
Thanks for coming though. All right, take care.